Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hammered another nail into the wooden fence post. The Montana wind was bitter cold, cutting through his worn jacket like it was made of paper. He'd been working on this ranch for 3 months now, which was longer than usual. Most times he stayed somewhere for 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at most before that familiar restlessness kicked in, and he'd pack up his truck and hit the road again. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Jake almost ignored it. Nobody really called, him except ranch foremen looking for temporary help. But something made him pull off his work gloves and check the screen. The number looked familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Hello? His voice came out rough from the cold morning air. Jake? Jake Martinez, this is Father Rodriguez from St. Mary's in Esperanza. Jake's blood went cold. Father Rodriguez. He remembered the old priest from when he was a kid, sitting in those hard wooden pews every Sunday morning while his mother clutched her rosary beads and prayed for his father to stop drinking. Yeah, this is Jake. He could barely get the words out. Son, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this over the phone. Your mother, Maria, passed away yesterday evening. Her heart gave out suddenly. She didn't suffer. The hammer slipped from Jake's other hand and hit the frozen ground with a dull thud. The world seemed to tilt sideways. His mother was only 58 years old. Sure, she'd had some health problems, but she'd always been the strong one in the family. She was the one who held everything together when his father came home drunk and angry. She was the one who made sure Jake had clean clothes for school and food in his lunchbox, even when money was tight. Jake? Are you there? Yeah. He sat down hard on a nearby fence post, his legs suddenly feeling like they couldn't hold him up. When's the funeral? Saturday morning at 10. I know it's short notice, but Maria always said she wanted a simple service. Nothing fancy. Jake stared out across the empty Montana landscape. 12 hours of driving separated him from Esperanza, New Mexico. 12 hours to travel back to a town he'd sworn he'd never set foot in again. A town full of people who knew exactly why he'd left and probably wondered why he'd stayed away for so long. I'll be there, he heard himself say. After he hung up, Jake just sat there on that fence post for a long time, watching his breath make little clouds in the cold air. 8 years. 8 years since he'd left Esperanza right after high school graduation, promising himself he'd never go back. 8 years of working cattle ranches from Texas to Wyoming, never staying anywhere long enough for people to really know him, never staying anywhere long enough to get hurt. The last time he'd talked to his mother was 3 years ago, and it hadn't gone well. She'd called him on his birthday, like she always did, and somehow the conversation had turned into an argument about his father. Jake had been angry that she'd stayed with the man for so many years, angry that she'd made excuses for his drinking, angry that she'd never just packed up and left like Jake had. You don't understand, mijo, she'd said in that tired voice he remembered so well. Marriage isn't something you just walk away from when things get hard. Like I walked away? He'd shot back. Is that what you're saying? That's not what I meant. But Jake had already made up his mind that she was judging him for leaving. He'd hung up angry, and every time she'd called after that, he'd let it go to voicemail. Eventually, she stopped calling. Now she was gone, and he'd never get to take back those angry words. He'd never get to tell her that he understood she was just doing the best she could with what she had. He'd never get to say he was sorry. The ranch foreman found him sitting there an hour later, still staring at nothing. You all right, Jake? That fence won't fix itself. Jake looked up at the older man. I need to go home. There's been a death in the family. Your family? The foreman seemed surprised. In 3 months of working together, Jake had never mentioned having family anywhere. My mother. Ah, hell, I'm sorry to hear that. The foreman pulled off his hat and ran his hand through his gray hair. Take all the time you need. Job will be here when you get back if you want it. Jake nodded his thanks, but he was already thinking that he probably wouldn't be coming back. He never did. It took him 2 hours to pack up his life. Everything he owned fit in the back of his pickup truck and one worn duffel bag. A couple changes of clothes, some work boots, his shaving kit, and a small wooden box that held the only Photos he had of his family. That was it. 32 years old, and everything he owned could be loaded up in 10 minutes. As he drove south on Highway 87, Jake tried to remember the last time he'd been happy to go somewhere, instead of just leaving, someplace else. He couldn't think of a single time. For 8 years, he'd been running from Esperanza, from the memories of his father's angry voice and his mother's worried face, from the feeling of being trapped in a small town where everybody knew your business. But now he was going back and he had no choice. The drive gave him too much time to think. Every mile marker reminded him of another year he'd stayed away, another Christmas he'd missed, another birthday that had passed without a phone call. His mother had sent him cards for the first few years, forwarding them through whatever ranch he was working at the time. The cards always said the same thing. Thinking of you, mijo. Hope you're happy. Love, Mama. He'd stopped opening them after a while. It was easier that way. By the time Jake crossed into New Mexico, the sun was setting behind him, painting the sky orange and purple. The landscape started to look familiar even after all these years. The way the mesas rose up from the desert floor, the way the cottonwood trees lined the riverbeds, the way the mountains looked blue in the distance. This had been home once, before home became something he ran from. Esperanza looked smaller than he remembered. The main street was exactly the same, though. Martinez Hardware was still there, run by some distant cousin he'd never really known. The Dairy Queen where he'd worked summers during high school was still serving the same menu. Even the old Phillips 66 station looked like nobody had touched it since 1995. Jake drove straight to Gonzalez's funeral home without stopping anywhere else. He wasn't ready to see people yet. Wasn't ready for the questions and the sympathy and the inevitable comments about how long he'd been gone. The funeral home was exactly like he remembered it from when his father had died 5 years ago. Dark, wood paneling, thick carpet that muffled footsteps, and that heavy smell of flowers mixed with old air conditioning. Mr. Gonzalez met him at the front desk, older now but still wearing the same serious black suit. Jake, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman. Thank you. Jake's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. She's in the viewing room if you'd like to see her. Take all the time you need. Jake walked down the familiar hallway, his boots making soft sounds on the carpet. The viewing room was small and dimly lit with folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing the front. And there, in a simple wooden casket surrounded by white lilies, was his mother. She looked so small. That was the first thing that hit him. Maria Martinez had always seemed larger than life to Jake, the woman who could handle anything, who kept the family together through sheer force of will. But lying there in her best dress, the blue one she wore to church on special occasions, she looked fragile and peaceful. Jake walked up to the casket slowly, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mother's face was smooth, free from the worry lines that had appeared after years of dealing with his father's drinking. Her hands were folded over her chest, holding the same rosary beads she'd carried to church every Sunday for as long as Jake could remember. He reached out to touch her hand, then pulled back. It felt wrong somehow. This wasn't his mother. His mother was warm hands that bandaged scraped knees and made the best enchiladas in town. This was just what was left after she was gone. Jake sank into one of the folding chairs in the front row and put his head in his hands. For the first time since Father Rodriguez's phone call, he let himself really feel it. The grief hit him like a physical punch to the chest. His mother was gone, and he was completely alone. No siblings, no aunts, or uncles he was close to, no girlfriend waiting for him anywhere. Just him and whatever life he could scrape together from one temporary job to the next. The realization of how isolated he'd become was almost worse than losing his mother. He stayed there for a long time, sitting in that quiet room with the woman who'd loved him no matter how far he ran or how long he stayed away. Outside, night fell over Esperanza, and Jake Martinez faced the fact that he was home for the first time in 8 years, and he had nowhere else to go. Saturday morning came too soon and not soon enough. Jake had spent the night in his old childhood bedroom, surrounded by things that belonged to a different version of himself. His high school football trophies still sat on the dresser, dusty, but arranged exactly where he'd left them. His mother had kept everything the same, like she was waiting for him to come back. Getting dressed for the funeral felt like putting on a costume. The black suit he'd bought at a thrift store in Billings hung loose on his frame. Ranch work had made him leaner and harder than the 18-year-old who'd last worn formal clothes in this room. He stared at himself in the mirror and saw his father's eyes looking back at him. The same dark brown, the same stubborn set to his jaw. It was unsettling. St. Mary's Church was fuller than Jake had expected. He'd forgotten how death brought people together in small towns, how everyone showed up whether they knew the family well or not. As he walked down the center aisle behind his mother's casket, he recognized faces from his childhood. Mrs. Rivera, from the grocery store, looking older but still wearing the same style of floral dress. Mr. Sandoval, who'd taught him math in 8th grade, now walking with a cane. People he hadn't thought about in years, all here because they'd cared about. His mother. The service passed in a blur. Father Rodriguez spoke about Maria's dedication to her family and her faith, about how she'd volunteered at the food bank every Tuesday for the past 10 years. Jake learned things about his mother's life that he'd never known, ways she'd helped people in town after he'd left. It made the guilt in his chest feel even heavier. When it came time for people to speak, Jake wasn't sure he could get up from the pew. But somehow his legs carried him to the front of the church, and he found himself looking out at all those familiar faces. "My mother," he started, his voice cracking a little. "My mother was the strongest person I knew. She raised me mostly by herself, and she never complained about it. She never made me feel like I was a burden, even when times were hard." He had to stop for a moment, the words getting stuck in his throat. "I know I haven't been around much these past few years. I know she deserved better than a son who stayed away so long, but I want everyone to know that she never stopped loving me, even when I made it hard for her to do it. That's the kind of person she was. She loved without conditions, and she never gave up on anyone." Jake couldn't say anything else. He walked back to his seat while people nodded and murmured their agreement. After the service, they lined up to shake his hand and share their memories of Maria. Story after story of his mother's kindness, her generosity, her quiet strength. Each one made Jake realize how much of her life he'd missed by staying away. "Talked about you all the time," said Mrs. Chen, who'd lived next door for 20 years, always bragging about her cowboy son, working ranches all over the country. She was so proud of you. She kept every newspaper clipping she could find about rodeos, thinking maybe she'd see your name, added Tom Wilson, who'd been in Jake's graduating class. Never did, but it didn't stop her from looking. The weight of their words was almost too much to bear. His mother had been proud of him, even though he'd given her nothing to be proud of. She'd bragged about a son who never called, looked for his name in newspapers when he'd never even competed in a rodeo. She'd built a version of his life in her mind that was so much better than the reality of it. After the burial at the small cemetery outside town, people gathered at the church hall for lunch. Jake knew he should stay, should talk to these people who'd cared about his mother, but he felt overwhelmed by their kindness and his own guilt. He slipped out the back door and walked the 6 blocks to his mother's house. The little adobe house looked exactly the same, with its blue-painted porch and the garden his mother had tended so carefully. Jake sat on the front steps and tried to figure out what he was supposed to do now. He'd planned to clean out the house, sell it, and get back on the road as quickly as possible. But being here, seeing how much his mother had meant to so many people, made him question everything. That evening, Jake couldn't stand being in the house anymore. Everything reminded him of conversations they'd never had, phone calls he'd never returned, visits he'd never made. He needed to get out, to go somewhere where he wouldn't feel his mother's presence in every room. He drove to Rosita's Diner, the only restaurant in town that stayed open past 7 o'clock. The place hadn't changed much since high school. Same red vinyl booths, same black and white checkered floor, same smell of coffee and fried food. It was mostly empty except for a few old-timers playing dominoes in the back corner, and one woman sitting alone at the counter. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and was wearing light blue scrubs, like she'd just gotten off work, at the hospital in the next town over. She was reading a paperback book while picking at a piece of apple pie, completely absorbed in whatever story was unfolding on the pages. Jake ordered coffee and a burger from Rosa, the owner's daughter who'd taken over the place a few years back. As he waited for his food, he found himself watching the woman at the counter. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place her. When she looked up from her book to take a sip of coffee, their eyes met in the mirror behind the counter. She smiled, a gentle, recognizing smile that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Jake Martinez," she said, turning on her stool to face him. "I heard you were back in town." Elena Vasquez. The name came to him suddenly, along with memories of a quiet girl who'd been 2 years behind him in school. She'd been smart, he remembered, always reading during lunch instead of hanging out with the popular kids. "I'm surprised you remember." "Me," Elena said, closing her book and setting it on the counter. "We didn't exactly run in the same circles. You tutored my friend Danny in chemistry senior year. He had the biggest crush on you." Elena laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "Poor Danny. I was so focused on getting into college that I missed all those signals completely." "Did you get into college, I mean?" "UNM for nursing school. Came back 3 years ago to take care of my grandmother and just stayed." She gestured around the empty diner. "Not exactly the big city adventure I'd planned, but it's been good." Jake nodded, not sure what to say. The idea of choosing to come back to Esperanza, of choosing to stay, was so foreign to him that he couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. "I'm really sorry about your mother," Elena continued, her voice gentle. "She was a wonderful woman. I used to help her with her grocery shopping when her arthritis got bad. She talked about you a lot." The guilt hit Jake like a physical blow. Here was another person who'd been there for his mother when he couldn't be bothered to pick up the phone. "Thank you," he managed, "for helping her. I should have." "Hey." Elena's voice was firm but kind. "Don't do that to yourself." She understood why you had to leave. She was proud of the life you built for yourself. Jake almost laughed, but it came out bitter instead. "What life? I work temporary jobs on other people's ranches and sleep in a different town every few months. That's not a life, that's just existing." Elena studied his face for a moment like she was trying to read something there. "Why did you leave? Really leave, I mean. Not just for college, but leave and never come back." It was a direct question, the kind people in small towns usually danced around. Jake found himself wanting to give her an honest answer, which surprised him. He'd gotten good at deflecting questions about his past over the years. "My father," he said simply, and the way it felt like I was turning into him if I stayed. The anger, the drinking, the feeling like I was trapped in a life I didn't choose. "Are you? Like him, I mean?" Jake considered the question. "I don't drink much. Haven't hit anyone. But the running away part? Yeah, I got that from him. He just ran to the bottom of a bottle instead of to different states." Rosa brought Jake's burger and refilled both their coffee cups. Elena moved from the counter to the booth across from Jake, bringing her pie with her. It felt natural, like they were old friends catching up instead of two people who'd barely known each other in high school. "Your grandmother still live in that yellow house on Maple Street?" Jake asked, remembering Elena's grandmother as a tiny woman who gave out the best candy on Halloween. "She does. 93 years old and still insists on doing her own cooking. I moved in with her when I came back from Albuquerque. Told myself it was temporary, but..." Elena shrugged. "She's family. And honestly, I like it here more than I thought I would." "What's to like?" The question came out harsher than Jake had intended. Elena didn't seem offended. Instead, she smiled like she'd been waiting for him to ask. "You know people here. Really know them. When Mrs. Martinez down the street has a bad day, I can tell, just by looking at her face. When the Gonzalez kids are up to something, their mother brings them by the clinic for checkups that are really just excuses to get them in front of an authority figure." She took a bite of pie and continued. "In Albuquerque, I took care of hundreds of patients, but they were all strangers. Here, I take care of people I've known my whole life. When I help someone get better, I see them at the grocery store next week and they tell me how they're feeling. It matters in a different way." Jake woke up the next morning in his childhood bed with sunlight streaming through the same blue curtains his mother had hung when he was 12. For a moment, he forgot where he was, reaching for the alarm clock that should have been on a nightstand in some Montana bunkhouse. Instead, his hand found the wooden cross his mother had given him for his confirmation, still hanging on the wall after all these years. The house felt different in the morning light. Less haunted by memories, more like a place where someone had actually lived and been happy. Jake made coffee in his mother's kitchen, using her favorite mug, the one with the faded roses that she'd had for as long as he could remember. As he sat at the small kitchen table, he noticed things he'd missed the night before. There were photos on the refrigerator, held up with magnets from places Jake had never been, pictures of his mother with her church group, with her neighbors, with people he didn't recognize but who were clearly important to her. In every photo, she was smiling. Really smiling, not the worried, tired expression he remembered from his childhood. One photo in particular caught his attention. His mother was standing in a garden, her hands dirty, holding a basket full of vegetables. She looked proud and happy, more vibrant than he'd seen her in years. There was a small plaque next to the photo that read, Community Garden Volunteer of the year 2022. Jake had no idea his mother had been involved in a community garden. In fact, looking around the kitchen, he realized there was a lot about her life he didn't know. The walls were covered with certificates and thank you cards from various organizations around town. The food bank, the literacy program, the senior center. His mother had been busy, had built a life full of purpose and connection while he'd been drifting from place to place. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. Jake opened it to find Elena standing on the porch, holding a covered casserole dish and looking a little uncertain. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said. "I brought you some food. Figured you probably haven't been eating much." "You didn't have to do that." But Jake stepped back to let her in, grateful for the company. The house had been feeling too quiet, too full of his mother's absence. Elena set the dish on the kitchen counter and looked around at the photos and certificates covering the walls. She was really proud of all this, she said gently. "Your mother, I mean, she loved being part of things, helping people." "I had no idea," Jake admitted. "About the garden, the volunteering, any of it. She never mentioned it when we talked." "When was the last time you really talked to her? Not just hello and how are you, but really talked?" Jake had to think about it, and the answer was painful. "Probably not since I left. We'd talk on the phone sometimes, but I was always in a hurry to get off. Always had work to do or someplace to be." Elena nodded without judgment. She knew you were living your life. She was proud of your independence even if she missed you. "Elena, can I ask you something? Yesterday you said you helped her with groceries and doctor visits. How much help did she need?" Elena paused, like she was choosing her words carefully. The last couple of years were harder for her. Her arthritis was getting worse and she'd had a few small heart episodes. Nothing major, but enough that I started checking on her regularly. She was proud, didn't like accepting help, but she let me drive her to appointments sometimes. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. His mother had been struggling with health problems and he'd had no idea. He'd been so wrapped up in his own life, his own need to keep moving, that he'd completely missed the fact that she might have needed him. "I should have known," he said, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs. "I should have been here." "Jake." Elena's voice was firm. She sat down across from him at the small table. "Beating yourself up isn't going to change anything, and honestly, your mother wouldn't want that. She was more worried about you than herself. Always wondered if you were happy, if you had people who cared about you." "I don't," Jake said without thinking. "Have people who care about me, I mean. Haven't really let anyone get close enough for that." Elena studied his face. "That sounds lonely." "It's easier," Jake replied automatically, but as the words came out he wondered if they were still true. "No complications, no obligations. Nobody gets hurt when you leave. Nobody gets loved when you leave either." The simple truth of Elena's words settled into the quiet kitchen between them. Jake had spent so many years focused on avoiding pain that he'd also avoided everything else. Joy, connection, the kind of deep relationships his mother had built with people in this town. Elena seemed to sense that he needed a change of subject. Want to see the community garden, where that photo was taken? It's just a few blocks away, and I think your mother would like knowing you saw it. Jake nodded, grateful for something to do that didn't involve sitting in his mother's house thinking about all the ways he'd failed her. They walked through the familiar streets of Esperanza, past houses Jake remembered from his childhood. The town looked smaller in daylight, more worn down than he remembered, but also somehow more real. These weren't just buildings. They were places where people lived their actual lives. The community garden was behind the library, a patch of land that had once been an empty lot. It was bigger than Jake had expected, with neat rows of vegetables and a few small fruit trees. There was a greenhouse at one end and a tool shed painted bright yellow. Even though it was late fall, there were still some winter vegetables growing, and the whole space had a sense of care and attention that spoke of many hands working together. Your mother was in charge of the tomatoes, Elena said, leading him to a section marked with a small wooden sign that read Maria's Patch. Best tomatoes in 3 counties. She had a secret to making them so sweet, but she never would tell anyone what it was. Jake knelt down and touched the soil where his mother's tomatoes had grown. It was rich and dark, well-tended. He could imagine her here in the early morning, watering the plants and pulling weeds, taking pride in watching things grow. She started coming here after your father died, Elena continued. Said she needed something living to take care of, something that would give back the love she put into it. She never told me about this place. Maybe she thought you wouldn't understand. You were always moving from place to place. I think this garden represented something different for her, putting down roots literally. Jake stood up and brushed the dirt off his hands. I'm starting to think I didn't know my mother at all. You knew the part of her that raised you and loved you, Elena said. That was real. But people grow and change, especially when they have to rebuild their lives after loss. Your mother created something beautiful here after your father died. Maybe that's something to celebrate instead of something to feel guilty about. They walked back toward town, taking a longer route that led them past the small clinic where Elena worked. It was a modest building with a cheerful blue door and flower boxes under the windows, even though the flowers had died back for winter. This is where you work? Jake asked. 3 days a week. The other 2 days I work at the hospital in Las Cruces. It keeps me busy and I like the variety. Different challenges, different people. What made you become a nurse? Elena smiled. My grandmother, actually. When I was 10, she had pneumonia and nearly died. I watched the nurses at the hospital take care of her, saw how they could make such a difference in people's lives with just their knowledge and compassion. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And you came back here to do it instead of staying in Albuquerque. The job in Albuquerque was at a big hospital. I was one of dozens of nurses on each shift, taking care of patients I'd never see again after they were discharged. Here, I know my patients. I know their families, their histories, their fears. When Mrs. Rodriguez comes in with chest pain, I know she's worried about her grandson who's deployed overseas. When little Jimmy Sandoval breaks his arm, I know he's trying to impress a girl at school. It makes the job more personal, more meaningful. Jake found himself thinking about the ranch hands he'd worked with over the years. He'd never really gotten to know any of them, had never stayed anywhere long enough to understand their stories or their struggles. He'd told himself that was professionalism, keeping work separate from personal life, but maybe it was just another way of avoiding connection. Doesn't it get overwhelming sometimes? Having everyone's problems be your problems? Sometimes, Elena admitted. But it also means that everyone's joys are your joys too. When Mrs. Chen beat cancer last year, the whole town celebrated. When the Hernandez family had their first baby after years of trying, I got to be part of that happiness. You can't have the good without risking the bad. They stopped for lunch at the small Mexican restaurant on Main Street, a place that had been there since Jake was a kid. The owner, an elderly woman named Carmen, recognized Jake immediately and insisted on bringing them extra food. Your mama was such a good woman, Carmen said, patting Jake's shoulder. She used to come in here every Tuesday after volunteering at the food bank. Always ordered the same thing, cheese enchiladas with green chili. Said it reminded her of her own mother's cooking. Another piece of his mother's life that Jake hadn't known about, another. Jake had been in Esperanza for a week when Elena knocked on his door early on a Tuesday morning, wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox that looked like it had seen better days. "I need a favor," she said without preamble. "My grandmother's chicken coop is falling apart and she's too proud to let me hire someone to fix it. But if a neighbor happened to volunteer..." Jake looked at the toolbox, then at Elena's hopeful expression. He'd planned to spend the day sorting through more of his mother's belongings, a task he'd been putting off because every box held another reminder of the life he'd missed. The idea of doing something with his hands, something useful and concrete, was appealing. "I haven't built anything in years," he warned her. "It's just repairs. How hard can it be?" Famous last words, Jake thought, but he followed Elena the 4 blocks to her grandmother's yellow house on Maple Street. The chicken coop in question was barely standing, held together more by habit than actual structural integrity. 3 chickens pecked around in the dirt nearby, looking unimpressed with their accommodations. Elena's grandmother, Consuela Vasquez, came out of the house to greet them. She was exactly as Jake remembered her from childhood, tiny but fierce, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Jake Martinez," she said in accented English, looking him up and down. "You look like your mother. She was a good woman, too good for that father of yours." "Abuela," Elena protested, but the old woman waved her off. "I'm too old to pretend, mija. The truth is the truth." She turned back to Jake. "You going to fix my chickens a proper house, or are you here to make excuses like every other man in this town?" Jake couldn't help but smile. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Vasquez. Call me Abuela. Everyone does." The next 3 hours reminded Jake why he'd always preferred working with animals to working with tools. The chicken coop was in worse shape than it had looked from a distance. The roof leaked, the walls were warped, and the door hung at an angle that defied physics. But gradually, with Elena handing him tools and Abuela offering commentary from her lawn chair, Jake began to make progress. "You know," Elena said, as Jake struggled to align a stubborn piece of siding. "Your mother mentioned once that you were good with your hands, said you built her a garden bench when you were in high school." Jake paused in his hammering. "I'd forgotten about that shop class project that turned into a gift for Mother's Day. She still had it, on her back porch. I saw it when I was helping her with yard work last spring." The idea that his mother had kept that simple wooden bench for all these years, that she'd looked at it and thought of him, made Jake's chest tight. He'd built it in a hurry, more focused on getting a decent grade than on making something lasting. But she'd treasured it. "Hand me that level," he said, needing to focus on something concrete. By noon, the chicken coop was structurally sound, if not exactly beautiful. The chickens seemed satisfied with their improved housing, and Abuela declared it good enough for government work, which Jake took as high praise. "Come inside," Abuela commanded. "Elena cooked lunch and I won't have you leaving hungry." The inside of the house was exactly what Jake expected. Lots of religious icons, family photos covering every surface, and the smell of something delicious coming from the kitchen. Elena had made pozole, a soup that transported Jake instantly, back to childhood, to his mother's kitchen on Sunday afternoons. "This tastes just like my mom's," he said between spoonfuls. "She taught me," Elena replied. "Last Christmas, when I complained that I couldn't make it right, she invited me over and walked me through every step, made me practice until I got it. Perfect." Another connection Jake hadn't known about, another way his mother had been present in people's lives. He was beginning to understand that his absence hadn't left a void in her world. She'd filled her days with other relationships, other ways of giving and receiving love. "Your mother worried about you," Abuela said, settling into her chair with her own bowl of soup. "Not because you left, but because you stayed gone so long without making a home anywhere." "I had homes, different ranches, different places." "Jobs aren't homes, mijo. A home is where people know your name, where they notice if you don't show up, where you have reasons to stay even when things get difficult." Jake wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. In 8 years of moving from place to place, he'd never once felt like he was leaving something important behind. He'd never had a reason to stay when the work got hard or the boss got difficult or the loneliness became too much. Maybe some people aren't meant for that kind of life, he said finally. Maybe some people are just scared of it, Abuela replied, and Jake couldn't tell if she was challenging him or just observing. After lunch, Elena walked with Jake back to his mother's house. They took the long way, past the school where they'd both grown up, past the park where Jake had played Little League baseball, past the small library that still had the same wooden shelves he remembered from childhood. "I've been thinking," Elena said as they walked, "about what you said the other night about not having people who care about you. I think maybe you've had them, you just didn't stay still long enough to notice." "What do you mean?" "I mean, in 8 years of working ranches, you must have met some good people. People who liked you, who were sorry to see you go. But you left, before it could turn into something deeper." Jake considered this. There had been people over the years who'd invited him for holiday dinners, who'd offered him permanent positions, who'd seemed disappointed when he announced he was moving on. At the time, he'd told himself it was just politeness, just the way people were supposed to act. But maybe Elena was right. Maybe he'd been so focused on avoiding attachment that he'd missed genuine connections. "There was this rancher in Wyoming," he said slowly. "Bill Henderson. Older guy. Wife had died a few years before I got there. He treated me more like family than an employee, invited me to Sunday dinners, taught me things about horses that I'd never learned anywhere else. What happened? I left. Contract was up and I had another job lined up in Colorado. Bill asked me to stay, offered me a permanent position and a piece of land to build a house on. Good wages, good benefits, but you said no. I said no." Jake stopped walking and looked at Elena. "And now I can't remember why. At the time it felt like staying would mean giving up something important, but I can't even remember what that something was supposed to be. Maybe it would have meant giving up the illusion that you could avoid being hurt if you just kept moving." They'd reached his mother's house, but neither of them moved toward the door. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces, and Jake found himself reluctant to end the conversation, to go back inside and face more boxes of his mother's life. "Elena, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Have you ever been in love? Serious love, the kind where you could see spending your whole life with someone?" Elena was quiet for a moment, and Jake wondered if he'd overstepped, but then she nodded. "Once. In nursing school. His name was David, and we had everything planned out. We were going to get married after graduation, move to Denver, start our careers together. What happened? My grandmother got sick, and I had to come home. David couldn't understand why I'd give up the job I'd worked so hard for, why I'd choose a small town over the opportunities we could have had in the city. He said I was throwing my life away. Do you think you were?" Elena looked around at the quiet street, at the mountains visible in the distance, at the small but well-maintained houses, where people she'd known her whole life were living their own complicated, meaningful lives. "No. I think David and I just wanted different things, and it took a crisis for us to realize it. He wanted to build something new together, and that's not wrong. But I wanted to preserve something that already existed, to be part of a community that had shaped me. Neither choice was right or wrong, just different. Do you regret it? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. But regret? No. I'm where I'm supposed to be." The certainty in her voice fascinated Jake. He couldn't imagine feeling that way about any place, couldn't imagine being so sure that he belonged somewhere. "How do you know?" he asked. "How do you know you're where you're supposed to be?" Elena smiled. "Because when I wake up in the morning, I'm glad to be here. When I go to work, I know that what I do matters to people I care about. When I come home at night, I feel like I'm coming home, not just going to a place where I sleep. And that's enough? The small town, the same faces, the same routines? Jake, do you know what the word intimacy really means?" He shook his head. "It comes from a Latin word that means innermost. Real intimacy isn't about passion or excitement, though those can be part of it. It's about knowing someone deeply, understanding their fears and dreams and quirks. It's about being known that way yourself." Elena sat down on his mother's front steps, and Jake joined her. I think you've spent so many years avoiding intimacy, with places, with people, with yourself, that you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly known. Your mother knew you that way once, when you were young. Maybe that's part of why you ran. It's scary to be seen that completely. Jake thought about the letters his mother had written him but never sent. 6 months after his mother's funeral, Jake Martinez woke up in the same bed he'd slept in the night before, and the night before that, and every night since he'd made the decision to stay in Esperanza. For someone who'd spent 8 years never sleeping in the same place for more than a few months, the routine should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like breathing after holding his breath for too long. The job at the Rivera Ranch had turned into something more steady than Jake had expected. Carlos Rivera, the owner, was a third-generation rancher who understood the value of having someone reliable, someone who knew cattle and wasn't afraid of hard work. When Jake had proven himself capable of handling the day-to-day operations, Carlos had offered him a permanent position and the use of a small foreman's cabin on the property. But Jake had surprised himself by turning down the cabin. He wanted to stay in his mother's house, at least for now, wanted to wake up surrounded by her things, her memories, her presence that still lingered in every room. It was part of learning to stay, he'd realized. Not running from the complicated emotions, but sitting with them until they became manageable. Elena had been right about learning to stay, being like learning any other skill. Awkward at first, requiring patience and practice. There had been mornings when Jake woke up with the familiar itch to pack his truck and hit the road, when the walls of the small town felt like they were closing in on him. But each time, he'd forced himself to stay one more day to see what would happen if he didn't run. What happened was that people began to know him again. Mrs. Chen, his mother's neighbor, started bringing him vegetables from her garden and updates about her son who worked in Albuquerque. Father Rodriguez asked him to help with the church's annual fundraiser, and Jake found himself organizing a barbecue dinner instead of making excuses to be somewhere else that weekend. Carmen at the Mexican restaurant stopped asking if he was just visiting and started asking how his work at the ranch was going. The hardest part had been dealing with his mother's belongings. Jake had initially planned to donate most of her things and sell the rest, but as he'd gone through each room, each box, each carefully kept memento, he'd found himself unable to let go of pieces of her life. The good dishes she'd saved for special occasions became his everyday plates. Her collection of books, romance novels, and biographies and gardening guides moved from her bedside table to his. Her gardening tools found their way to the community garden, where Jake had started tending her tomato patch. You don't have to keep everything, Elena had told him one evening as they worked side by side in Maria's garden plot, pulling weeds and planning what to plant for the spring season. I know, Jake had replied, carefully staking a tomato plant that was already showing signs of fruit. But keeping some of it feels right, like I'm continuing something she started instead of just ending it. Elena had smiled at that, and Jake had felt something shift between them. Over the past months, their friendship had deepened into something more complicated, more intimate. They ate dinner together twice a week, sometimes at his house, sometimes at hers with Abuela, providing commentary on everything from the weather to local politics. They worked together in the garden, took long walks through town, spent quiet evenings on his mother's back porch talking about everything and nothing. Jake had been careful not to push for more, not to assume that Elena's kindness meant she saw their relationship the same way he was beginning to see it. He'd hurt too many people by leaving to risk hurting someone he was learning to love by staying. But there were moments when he caught her looking at him with something more than friendship in her eyes. Moments when their hands would brush as they worked in the garden, when she'd lean against his shoulder as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, when she'd linger just a little too long when saying goodnight. The first anniversary of his mother's death arrived on a Tuesday in February, cold and clear. Jake had taken the day off work, planning to spend it at the cemetery and maybe at the church where Father Rodriguez had offered to say a special mass in Maria's memory. But when he woke up that morning, Elena was already in his kitchen, making coffee and scrambling eggs like she belonged there. "You don't have to do this alone," she said when she saw him in the doorway, still in his pajamas and probably looking confused. Elena, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Your mother was important to me too, and I think she'd like knowing we were together today. They spent the morning at the cemetery, cleaning his mother's grave and placing fresh flowers. Jake had expected the day to be overwhelmingly sad, but with Elena beside him, it felt more like a celebration than a mourning. They told stories about Maria, shared memories that made them both laugh, talked about the ways she continued to influence their daily lives. I found more of her recipes in a box yesterday, Jake said as they sat on the stone bench near her grave. Instructions for making tamales for Christmas written out like she was planning to teach someone. Probably me if I'd ever stayed still long enough to learn. It's not too late, Elena said. I could teach you. My grandmother has the same recipe. All the women in this town learned from each other. You'd do that? Jake, making tamales is a community effort. You need at least 3 people to do it right, and preferably more. It's about bringing people together as much as it is about the food. That afternoon, they went to the community garden, where Jake had decided to expand his mother's plot. He wanted to add a small greenhouse, nothing fancy, just somewhere to start seedlings and extend the growing season. As they worked side by side, measuring and planning, Jake realized that this was what contentment felt like. Not constant happiness, but a deep sense of being in the right place at the right time with the right person. Elena, he said, stopping, mid-sentence in his explanation of greenhouse placement. I need to tell you something. She looked up from the notebook where she'd been sketching possible layouts. Okay. I'm falling in love with you. The words came out more abruptly than he'd planned, but he couldn't take them back, and he found he didn't want to. I've been trying not to, because I'm still figuring out how to stay in one place, how to be the kind of man someone could count on, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just friendship. Elena set down her pencil and looked at him seriously. Jake, can I ask you something? His heart sank. This was it. The gentle rejection. The explanation of why she couldn't see him that way, of course. When you think about your future now, where do you see yourself in 5 years? It was not the question he'd expected. Jake thought about it, really thought about it, trying to envision a life that extended beyond the next few months or the next job opportunity. Here, he said, and realized he meant it completely. I see myself here, in Esperanza, working the ranch, maybe expanding this garden plot, taking care of this house, learning how to make tamales and helping with the church fundraisers and knowing everyone's name at the grocery store. With me? If you'll have me. If you want that too. Elena smiled, the kind of smile that started small and grew until it lit up her whole face. Jake, I've been in love with you since that first night at the diner, when you talked about your mother and I could see how much you were hurting. I've been waiting for you to figure out that you wanted to stay, not just for her memory, but for yourself, for us. And I have? Figured it out, I mean? Instead of answering with words, Elena kissed him. It was soft and sweet and tasted like the promise of a future Jake had never allowed himself to imagine. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and marveled at how right this felt. How perfectly Elena fit into the life he was building in the place he'd once been so desperate to escape. There's something else, Elena said, her hand still resting on his chest. Something I need to tell you about your mother. Jake tensed slightly. What about her? The last time I saw her, a few days before she died, we were talking about you. She told me she had a feeling you'd come home someday and not just for a visit. She said she could feel that you were getting tired of running, that you'd eventually figure out the difference between being free and being lost. She said that? She also said that when you did come home, you'd need someone to help you remember how to love a place, how to love people. She hoped it would be someone who understood both, the pull of the road and the pull of home. Jake felt tears sting his eyes. Even at the end, his mother had been thinking about him, hoping for his happiness, believing in his capacity for growth and change. Do you think she would have liked seeing us together? I think she'd be thrilled. She always said I needed someone in my life who would challenge me to see the world differently, and you do that. You make me want to travel more, experience new things even if I always come back here. and you make me want to stay, to build something that lasts instead of just passing through. They spent the rest of the afternoon working in the garden, planning for spring, talking about the future they wanted to create together. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Jake looked around at the plot of land where his mother had grown her tomatoes, where he was now planning to build a greenhouse, where Elena was sketching ideas for a children's